Okay, so for all you philosophy enthusiasts out there, think about this for a second. Have you ever really considered what it takes to define a whole philosophical tradition, like from the inside, where figuring out what it is becomes a philosophical problem in itself?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point to start with. Because a lot of times when we dig into different philosophical schools or movements, the basic idea of what makes up that tradition is already pretty much settled. But
Hmm.
what we're looking at today, Latin American philosophy, that's kind of a different story.
Right, exactly. So today we're diving deep, really deep, into the heart of what makes Latin American philosophy tick. We're using this super in depth entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy called Latin American Philosophy Metaphilosophical Foundations. It's like philosophy squared, right? A deep dive into the very nature of thinking about philosophy, but within a specific cultural context.
And what we really want to get at is understanding the big debates within Latin American philosophy about what Latin American philosophy even is. It's a tradition turning the philosophical lens inward, examining itself. So we'll come across skepticism about whether it even exists, and then different ways people have tried to pin down what makes it unique and all that. And this whole self-reflective thing, I think as a fellow philosopher, you can appreciate this. It has some pretty big implications for how we understand philosophy in general.
I'm totally with you on that. So, digging a little deeper here, the source points out that the self-reflection thing, it's not new. It goes way back to the 19th century when Latin American nations were becoming independent, and it really picked up steam in the 20th century as academic philosophy grew. What were those initial sparks that made them think, hold on, we need to figure out what our philosophy is all about?
Well, what's fascinating is that a lot of it started with this kind of uneasiness about mainstream conceptions of philosophy, right? Like thinkers in Latin America were wondering if those dominant ways of thinking about philosophy, which mostly came from Europe, if those really fit their own intellectual and cultural experiences.
So it wasn't just about fitting into an existing mold, but figuring out if that mold even made sense for them.
Exactly. And that led to this whole philosophical journey of figuring out where they stood and what their own philosophical voice was.
And it wasn't just confined to one style of philosophy either. The source talks about two main types of philosophy in Latin America.
Right. So there's what we call academic philosophy, which is that structured Western-style approach that became established in the 20th century, kind of like how philosophy became professionalized in other parts of the world. But at the same time, there's this really long and rich tradition of what we call non-academic philosophy.
Which is a much broader category, right? Like it's not just academics doing philosophy in their ivory towers.
Totally. It's more like philosophical reflections woven into the writings of political leaders, religious figures, scientists, even literary figures, going all the way back to the 16th century. A great example is Octavio Paz's Labyrinth of Solitude. It's a literary essay, but it's packed with these deep philosophical explorations. Contrast that with something like Carlos Vaz Ferreira's Logica Viva, which is a classic example of rigorous academic philosophy focused on logic.
And then there are these fascinating cases that are kind of in between, like Bartolomé de las Casas and what's known as Lascagianism.
Yeah, Lascagianism is interesting. It's the ethical framework that Bartolomé de las Casas developed way back during the colonial era, and it had a huge impact on liberation theology later on with thinkers like Gustavo Gutierrez. It's tricky because it has a strong philosophical foundation and deals with big ideas, especially about the rights of indigenous peoples. But it wasn't developed within the formal structures of academia. It came from individuals who were deeply involved in other areas. And this kind of makes us as philosophers think about the different ways philosophical insights can pop up.
It challenges our assumptions about where philosophy belongs.
So thinking about origins, the source also digs into this really basic question. When did philosophy actually begin in Latin America? And it seems like the answer depends on which type of philosophy we're talking about.
Right, because if we're just talking about formal academic philosophy,
Then the evidence points to its presence, mostly connected to universities and schools, even back in the colonial period. Like Antonio Rubio's Logica Mexicana was a textbook used all over the place back then. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that philosophy in Latin America really developed into its modern academic form, with dedicated university departments, journals, and all the professional standards we'd expect.
but for me, the more interesting question, philosophically speaking, is whether we should consider pre-Columbian thought as part of this philosophical story, even within that broader non-academic tradition.
Now that's where things get really interesting. Because pre-Columbian thought, it's obviously very different in how it expresses ideas and in its methods compared to what we usually think of as philosophy today.
Mm.
But even in Western philosophy, right? Thinkers like the pre-Socratics or Wittgenstein, they present ways of thinking that don't fit neatly into modern analytical standards.
So are we talking about finding the seeds of philosophical ideas in those pre-Columbian cultures, or are we talking about fully developed philosophical systems?
Well, there are thinkers like Francisco Miro Quesada who argue that we need to understand philosophy more broadly, and that would definitely include aspects of Mayan and Inca thought. And then there's textual evidence from the Aztecs, analyzed by scholars like Bernardino de Sahagún and Miguel León Portilla, that points to philosophical dimensions within Aztec thought as well. James Maffei, for instance, has done some great work exploring Aztec metaphysics.
And there are different terms for how we categorize this pre-Columbian intellectual heritage. The source mentions proto-philosophy and ethnic philosophy.
Right. So Susanna Nuccitelli uses proto-philosophy to describe these earlier forms of inquiry that were happening outside the academic world. And Jorge Gracia's idea of ethnic philosophy, which we'll get into more later, can also fit pre-Columbian thought into the bigger picture of Latin American philosophy. But Gracia himself is pretty cautious, especially when it comes to interpreting texts like the Popol Vuh. He emphasizes that we still need a lot more historical research to really back up these philosophical labels.
And all of this leads us to that big central question that's been on the minds of so many Latin American philosophers. What is Latin American philosophy, really? Augusto Salazar Bondi's way of looking at these debates seems pretty useful here.
Totally. Salazar Bondi categorized the key issues into three groups: descriptive, prescriptive, and those dealing with identity. Now, the lines between these categories can be a little blurry sometimes, but his framework still gives us a good way to look at these ongoing discussions. And one thing that's especially interesting from a philosophical point of view is that questions about originality and authenticity, which used to be seen as simple matters of fact, are now understood as having a kind of evaluative dimension. Like, they're similar to what we might call thick moral concepts, where description and evaluation are all mixed up.
So let's unpack those descriptive questions first. Maybe the most basic one and the hardest one for someone outside the tradition to grasp is the question of whether philosophy, as we understand it, even exists in Latin America. It seems like a pretty bold question, but it's one that's been taken seriously within the tradition.
It definitely has. The general view is that autonomous academic philosophy, philosophy as an independent discipline with its own goals and methods, that really took hold in the early 20th century. But like we were talking about earlier, broader forms of philosophical thought have roots going all the way back to colonial times. This is why there are different timelines, with some folks saying Latin American philosophy is pretty recent, and others tracing it back centuries. Francisco Romero pointed out that even if philosophical thinking existed earlier, its main function was often teaching, not the kind of critical and creative rethinking of ideas that we usually associate with serious philosophy.
So, to get a little more technical for a minute, for you as a philosopher, the source breaks down this existence question into three parts: autonomy, the presence of stable traditions and communities of thinkers, and professional status according to Western academic standards. Let's start with autonomy, the idea that philosophy in Latin America is separate from other disciplines.
Right. So starting in the early 20th century, there was this big push to assert philosophy's independence from things like science, theology, literature, and politics. Thinkers like Alberini, Romero, and Miro Quesada were really important in promoting this separation. But we have to remember that in earlier periods, especially during colonial times and in the 19th century with the rise of positivism, philosophical inquiry was often tied up with education and sociopolitical concerns.
It wasn't seen as this separate, specialized field in the same way.
Exactly. And the establishment of this autonomous academic philosophy with its own institutions and high standards, that was largely the work of the founders' generation, as the source calls them.
This was a specific group of philosophers who really pushed for that professionalization.
Yeah. Between the 1910s and the 1940s, this group worked hard to establish philosophy as a distinct discipline within universities. They started professional organizations, developed institutional structures to match those in Western academic centers. Eduardo Robosi actually makes the point that this happened relatively quickly compared to how slowly philosophy became professionalized in Europe. And by the 1940s, you have things like Alejandro Korn's key role in creating the Facultad de Filosofía y Letras in Buenos Aires, which shows that both autonomy and professional status were pretty much achieved by then.
But then, later on, a group of thinkers called the New Skeptics came along and challenged this whole idea that there are stable philosophical traditions and communities within Latin America. This goes back to that second part of the existence question. What were their main arguments?
The New Skeptics, which includes thinkers like Izquierda, Garcia Ramirez, Hurtado, Pareda, and Rebolsi, they focus on what they call the invisibility problem. And this invisibility has two sides, the internal dialogue problem, or IDP, and the external dialogue problem, or EDP.
Let's break those down. So, the internal dialogue problem, the IDP, this suggests that Latin American philosophers aren't really engaging with each other's work in a deep way. What kind of evidence do they use to support that?
Well, a lot of the evidence is based on observations and anecdotal accounts, like people noticing that philosophers at conferences aren't really digging into each other's ideas, or that there's this neglect of their own philosophical heritage, maybe because it's seen as less interesting or sophisticated compared to imported ideas. Pareda, he points to the Encyclopedia Iberoamericana de Filosofía, a huge comprehensive encyclopedia, and notes that there aren't many references to Latin American publications in it. Rossi uses this really vivid metaphor of the guacho, the orphan who doesn't acknowledge or connect with their own philosophical lineage. And Hurtado talks about this modernizing model where philosophers tend to form small, isolated groups focused on the latest trends from abroad, always jumping on the next new thing without really engaging with older local traditions or even with each other.
It's like they're so busy chasing the next shiny object that they're missing the connections and depth that could come from looking closer to home.
Exactly. And then you have the external dialogue problem, the EDP, which is about the lack of meaningful engagement between Latin American philosophers and philosophers from other parts of the world, especially those in Western philosophical circles.
So it's not just about internal conversations, but about how Latin American philosophy is seen and interacted with on a global scale.
Right. Hurtado argues that even when philosophers from other regions visit Latin America, they rarely cite or really engage with the work of local thinkers, which suggests a real lack of intellectual exchange. And he thinks the IDP contributes to the EDP. Like, if Latin American philosophers aren't talking to each other, it's harder for them to be part of the bigger global conversation.
It makes sense. If you're not having those robust internal discussions, it's harder to project a strong, unified voice outwards.
Exactly. But the interesting thing is, the source points out a bit of a counter-argument here. It suggests that the New Skeptics themselves might be guilty of the very thing they're criticizing.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
Well, they all agree that there's a lack of internal dialogue, and they offer ideas for how to improve things. But it seems like they're not really engaging with each other's ideas on this topic very much. Like, they're not citing each other or having direct conversations about it. So it raises the question, are they inadvertently doing the same thing they're criticizing?
It's almost like a philosophical irony, isn't it?
Right. And another point is that there's this ongoing intense debate between the New Skeptics and those who disagree with them. So that suggests that claim number two, the idea that there are no stable traditions of dialogue, maybe that hasn't been proven. The fact that they're having this heated debate means there's at least some kind of internal engagement happening.
So it's not quite as simple as saying there's no dialogue at all.
Exactly. Now, moving on from the question of whether Latin American philosophy exists, let's talk about the normative questions, which are about whether it should be original, authentic, or unique in some way. This takes us into the debate between universalism and distinctivism.
Okay, so these are two pretty big philosophical camps.
They are. On one side, you have strong universalism, which says that all real philosophy is universal. Doesn't matter where it comes from, it has value and meaning for everyone. On the other side, you have strong distinctivism, which says that all philosophical thought is shaped by the specific region and culture it comes from.
And within Latin American philosophy, there are some who lean toward that universalist view, right?
Yeah, you've got some prominent contemporary thinkers like Pablo Navarro, Jorge Gracia, and Carlos Montemur, who represent this modern universalist perspective. They often compare philosophy to science, arguing that just like science aims to discover universal truths, philosophy should too. It's interesting, though, because a classic universalist like Rizieri Frondizi, who advocated for these universal standards, he ended up saying that a lot of Latin American philosophy in the 1940s wasn't really philosophy because it wasn't original enough.
So even within universalism, there's this idea that philosophy needs to contribute something new, or at least approach things in a fresh way.
Right. And even the concept of originality itself can mean different things. It can mean being creative and coming up with brand new ideas, or it can mean being creative in how you interpret and apply existing ideas. or being contributing new concepts that are valuable to the field, or even being the starting point for a new tradition. It's not always clear what people mean when they talk about originality.
So how does this play out in the context of Latin American philosophy?
Well, there's this whole discussion about the originality problem, which was sparked by Frondizi's claim that only about 10% of Latin American philosophy was truly original. Nucitelli countered that by saying that maybe non-academic philosophers in Latin America were actually more original than people give them credit for. And she pointed out that in other philosophical traditions, non-academics are often seen as making important contributions. Gracia also reminds us that originality isn't usually a requirement for something to be considered philosophy in other ethnic philosophies. Pareda, he acknowledges that there's an originality problem, but he thinks it's partly caused by what he calls arrogant reasoning.
Arrogant reasoning, that sounds intriguing.
Yeah. He says it includes this nationalist fervor that some distinctivists have, where they're so focused on being different that they maybe miss opportunities for genuine originality. But he also talks about a subaltern fervor and a craving for novelty among some universalists, which he thinks can also hinder originality. Basically, she's saying that both extremes can get in the way of developing truly original thought.
So even the desire to be part of a universal philosophical conversation, if it just means adopting the latest trends, can stifle the development of new ideas that are grounded in local contexts.
Exactly. There's this pressure to keep up with the newest theories, and that can distract from the kind of deep critical engagement that's needed to come up with genuinely original insights. Now, Izquierdia has a more nuanced view. He says that Latin American philosophy does show interpretative originality, meaning that it has its own way of engaging with existing philosophical ideas. But he thinks it needs to develop more problem-making and problem-solving originality to be more fully engaged in dialogue with philosophers from other parts of the world.
So it's about not just interpreting, but also contributing to the ongoing development of philosophical thought.
Right. And then there's Garcia Ramirez, who kind of dismisses the whole originality problem as a non-issue, which is interesting because he also says there's a lack of independent thinking in the field. So it makes you wonder, can you really have genuine originality without independent thinking?
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah. But it shows how complex this whole issue of originality is. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the authenticity problem. This seems to be particularly important to the distinctivist perspective. They're concerned with whether Latin American philosophy is genuine, sincere, and not just a copycat of other traditions.
It's about being true to oneself, philosophically speaking.
Exactly. And they distinguish authenticity from peculiarity, which just means having a regional Latin American flavor or style, like maybe focusing on particular themes or drawing on the author's cultural background. You can have peculiarity without originality or authenticity, and you can have originality and authenticity without a strong regional flavor. The distinctivists, they really emphasize this pursuit of authenticity, believing that originality will naturally come from a genuine engagement with their own context.
So it's not about forcing originality, but about letting it emerge organically from a deeper connection to one's own culture and experiences.
Right. And one of the early proponents of a distinctly Latin American philosophy was Juan Bautista Alberti, who thought it should focus on social and political issues rather than abstract metaphysical stuff.
Oh.
But his views on Europe's role in theoretical work were pretty controversial.
How so?
Well, he basically said that Europe should handle the theoretical stuff, while Latin America should focus on more practical matters, which rubs some people the wrong way. And as Arturo Ardao pointed out, Alberti's ideas didn't really gain traction until much later in the 20th century, thanks to interpretations by José Gauss in Mexico. So it's not like there was this direct, immediate influence.
It's interesting how ideas can have a delayed impact, sometimes taking root in a different context or through a different lens.
Absolutely. Now, the source goes on to talk about two main types of what it calls extreme distinctivism, critical theory and circumstantialism. Let's start with critical theory.
Okay, so what's the critical theory take on this?
Critical theory, which is heavily influenced by Marxist thought and liberation philosophy, argues that Latin American philosophy lacks originality, authenticity, and even peculiarity because of this lingering colonial mentality and dependence on Western powers. Thinkers like Mariátegui, Coutinho, Salazar Bondi, and Roig, they all argue that a lot of Latin American intellectual work is just derivative, a pale imitation of European ideas.
But there are counterexamples to that, right? And critiques of critical theory itself.
There are. A lot of people point to Bartolomé de las Casas and his ethics as a counterexample. He developed his ideas during colonial times, but they're considered original, authentic, and unique. So he shows that dependence doesn't automatically mean a lack of originality.
Mm.
And there have been some ad hominem critiques of critical theory itself. Like some people point out that the theorists themselves come from privileged backgrounds and rely on European intellectual frameworks. So by their own logic, maybe their critiques aren't so authentic either.
It's always good to examine the assumptions and potential biases of any theoretical perspective.
For sure. Now, the other type of extreme distinctivism is circumstantialism, which is most associated with Leopoldizia. The main idea here is that authenticity is tied to reflecting your specific cultural circumstances.
So your philosophy is authentic because it comes from your particular context.
Right. Circumstantialism says that all philosophical work is inherently authentic because it's shaped by the unique cultural context in which it's created. So anything coming from Latin America is automatically authentic because it was created within that context. Zia thought this approach solved the whole universalism versus distinctivism debate. He acknowledged that there are universal philosophical problems, but the way you interpret and address those problems is influenced by your local circumstances.
So it's a way of recognizing both the universal and the particular.
Exactly. But there are some problems with the basic premise of circumstantialism. Like Nucitelli points out that it's not always clear what makes a theory specifically Greek or German, and the connection between a work's context and its philosophical authenticity, as opposed to just having some regional flavor, that's not always clear either.
Yeah.
Gracia also mentions that it's hard to define a single Latin American cultural circumstance because the region is so diverse.
Yeah, Latin America is a huge category that covers a lot of different cultures and histories.
Totally. So, moving on, the source talks about this more recent trend in these metaphilosophical discussions, reductionism. This is the idea that Latin American philosophy should mostly, maybe even exclusively, focus on historical, social, and economic issues that are relevant to Latin Americans.
So instead of trying to engage with broader philosophical questions, it should focus on very specific local concerns.
That's the idea. Thinkers like José Antonio Orozco, who focuses on Mexican-American philosophy, argue that the real value and potential of Latin American philosophy lie in addressing issues of identity, power, and citizenship within Latin American communities, including those in the U.S., and these are super important areas to explore. But the problem is that if these are seen as the only legitimate areas for Latin American philosophy, then it becomes a kind of reductionism, shutting out other philosophical avenues. Like Silva Grant proposed that it should focus specifically on the struggle against colonialism, which Elizabeth Milan Bruslin criticized as being too narrow and exclusionary. Nucitelli is also against this reductionist tendency. She says it's a form of relativism that could actually harm Latin American philosophers because they might be seen as only making empirical claims about their specific contexts, not engaging in big-picture philosophy.
So it's about striking a balance between addressing those specific contextual concerns and engaging with broader philosophical questions.
Exactly. And thankfully, the discussion doesn't end there. The source then looks at some middle way theories that try to find a path between strong universalism and strong distinctivism. One of those is Jorge Gracia's ethnic philosophy account, which is really interesting.
Okay, what's his take?
Gracia takes a neo-Wittgensteinian approach. He says we should think of Latin American philosophy as the philosophy of a specific ethnos, which means a cultural group. And he uses Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances to argue that there aren't any essential features that all Latin American philosophy has to share. Just being the philosophy of the Latin American ethnos is enough. This way of looking at it allows for a lot of flexibility, so you can have all sorts of different philosophical work being considered part of Latin American philosophy. It all depends on the context and your selective point of view. He compares it to Picasso. You can categorize Picasso's work as either French or Spanish, depending on what aspect you're focusing on.
So it's not about a rigid definition, but about a web of connections and shared history.
Right. And that lets you include a wide range of work, from very localized, non-standard philosophy to more mainstream, universally oriented stuff. But the challenge with this kind of flexible account is that it could slip into anything goes relativism. Gracia tries to avoid that by saying that reality and history provide some constraints. But even then, a hardcore relativist could say that our understanding of reality and history is also shaped by our context.
So it's a tricky balancing act.
It is. Another middle way theory is Carlos Ulises Moulin's compromise account. He tries to give us some sufficient conditions for considering something Latin American philosophy without saying these are the only conditions.
Okay, what are his conditions?
He says there are 4. The work has to use universal philosophical concepts and arguments. It has to be written by Latin American authors. It has to involve at least some original development in Latin America, and it has to be of interest to people both inside and outside Latin America. He gives examples like pair-consistent logic, formal deontic logic, belief revision theories, scientific realism, the history of physics, and the structuralist theory of science as philosophical work done in Latin America that fits these conditions. His account is trying to find a middle ground between universalism and distinctivism.
So it acknowledges both the global nature of philosophy and the specific context of Latin America.
Exactly. And then we have Susanna Nuccitelli's applied philosophy account. She tries to give us conditions that are both necessary and sufficient for what she calls characteristically Latin American philosophy.
What are her conditions?
She says that a philosophical work is characteristically Latin American if it's sufficiently original and sensitive to a Latin American context. And she argues that there's a whole body of work in moral, social, and political philosophy that meets these conditions, written by both academic and non-academic thinkers in Latin America. She sees Latin American philosophy as an important branch of applied philosophy, which exists alongside more universal philosophy.
So it's not an either-or situation. Latin American philosophers can engage in both types of philosophy.
Exactly. And the last section of the source tackles something that seems pretty straightforward: the name Latin American philosophy. But it turns out that even this simple label is complicated, with different terms being used and all sorts of semantic and pragmatic issues.
Yeah, it's not just about picking a name, it's about what that name implies and the baggage it carries.
Right. Like whether you use thought or philosophy often depends on whether you're including non-academic work. But then the qualifiers themselves, Latin American, Ibero-American, Hispanic, Latino, they all come with their own semantic baggage, meaning the issues related to their meaning and scope, and pragmatic issues, meaning the historical and cultural connotations.
So let's unpack that a bit. What are some of the problems with the term Latin America itself?
Well, some people say it's too broad. It lumps together a huge variety of cultures and nations. Others say it's too narrow because it might exclude certain groups within the Americas. Even Gracia, when he tries to define it by listing the countries it includes, he ends up having to rely on a cultural understanding of what's considered American, U.S., and Canadian.
Yeah.
It's not a clean-cut definition.
And what about those other terms?
Robasi tries to define it based on shared history, languages, and religion, focusing on the legacy of Iberian colonialism. This avoids the problem of being too broad, but it could be seen as too narrow because it might exclude indigenous traditions and other cultural expressions. Hurtado raises another important point. He says the term Latin America itself was actually created by the French in the 19th century for colonialist purposes. So he asks, why should we keep using a term that has such a problematic history?
That's a valid question. Language isn't neutral. It carries history and power dynamics with it.
Exactly. And the alternatives aren't perfect either. Ibero-American and Hispanic American both have connotations of colonialism. Hispanic philosophy and Latino philosophy have less clear meanings, and they all inherit these issues of identity and inclusion.
So it seems like there's no easy answer here.
There really isn't. The source concludes by raising this really interesting metaphilosophical point. It asks whether these pragmatic problems actually matter if the names are just functioning as labels, not as accurate descriptions. Like, if everyone agrees that Latin American philosophy refers to a certain body of work, does it matter if the term itself is perfectly defined or historically unproblematic?
That's a great question to leave us with. So, to wrap things up, we've seen that defining Latin American philosophy has been a major philosophical project within the tradition itself. It's this incredibly rich and complex area with all these debates about its autonomy, originality, authenticity, and its relationship to philosophy as a whole. It's this constant back and forth between wanting to be part of a universal conversation and wanting to honor its own unique context.
And going through these internal discussions and disagreements, it becomes clear that Latin American philosophy has a lot to teach us about bigger metaphilosophical questions that go beyond a specific region. Like, how do we define the boundaries of philosophy? How do history and culture shape intellectual work? What is the nature and purpose of philosophy itself? All these questions come up when you look at how Latin American philosophy has grappled with its own identity.
So, for you, as someone who's deep into philosophy, here's something to think about. Given all these different perspectives and the ongoing debates within Latin American philosophy, what do you think is the most important thing when it comes to defining a distinct philosophical tradition? And how does the historical and cultural context where philosophy happens, how does that inevitably shape even the most abstract, universal philosophical ideas? It's a good reminder that the foundation of our philosophical understanding, it's not always as simple and straightforward as we might think.